Hello and welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. This is episode 35. My name is Tom Luongo and we have a lot to talk about. It's Tuesday, May 26th, and Brexit is back in the news. We've reached crunch time in the EU-UK free trade agreement talks, and it looks like the EU may finally have met its match. We'll discuss this and more, but before I do, I want to remind you that you can follow my work over at my blog at tomluongo.me. You can follow me on Twitter at TFL1728. Live streams, they happen on YouTube and DLive.tv every Monday night at 8 p.m. and every Friday night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Warning, I'm a bad boy, I've got a potty mouth, and I am not afraid to use it. You can also support verified publishers like myself by downloading and installing the Brave browser, where you can get paid in crypto tokens called BAT for voluntarily being served internet advertising as opposed to feeding the Google beast. Use my referral code at brave.com/405 to help support the podcast directly. If you use Brave for more than 30 days, I'll get the referral fee. Lastly, you can join over 400 people who support me on Patreon at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns, where you can sign up for the private market reports published every Wednesday and Sunday, and or the Gold, Goats, and Guns monthly newsletter designed to wrap up all this geopolitical chaos, the global macroeconomics, and shifting cultural trends into a portfolio strategy designed to help you make sense of a world going mad. All right, let's talk Brexit. Brexit hasn't been a story for a few months, right? The UK left. What's the story? Is there a story? Well, there still is a story, because the UK is not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. Legally leaving the European Union left them in the situation where then they have to negotiate for a free trade agreement, and they're in what's called a transition period. So they've legally left, but they're still bound by all the EU's laws until the end of the transition period. Now, that transition period is supposed to sunset at the end of this year on December 31st. It could be extended for another 2 years if the UK applies for an extension by the end of June, so on June 30th. This is the timeline. It's very important that we remind ourselves what the timeline is. The important thing for pro-Brexiteers to remember, like myself, and hopefully most of you in the audience, the failure to separate the UK from EU laws, the European Court of Justice, and all the quote-unquote level playing field equals remain. It's not Brexit. What the EU is trying to do during these free trade agreement talks is to create Brexit in name only, or what we call BRINO, right? Brexit in name only. By forcing the UK to stay in the single market effectively, to stay in the customs union, to allow the European Court of Justice to be the final arbiter of any trade rule disagreement or any legal disagreements. How is that any different than being in the EU? It's not. Ultimately, this is what's going on. Moreover, regardless of the free trade agreement itself, would like to get the transition period extended for another 2 years simply to keep the UK under EU auspice in case there's a massive sovereign debt crisis or depression or any of the other things that are currently happening, right? Because the UK is still paying into the EU's budget every year, and it's billions of pounds. So these are all issues that were part of Brexit and part of the original Brexit talks and all of that stuff. And everything about this dynamic between the UK and the EU changed when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. Now, you'll remember, I was not convinced that Boris Johnson was the guy to do what he's currently doing. And the funny part about it is that he has turned out to be that guy. And there's a lot of reasons why that's occurred. And we're going to get to that later in the podcast, because I think that's part of what's important about this. Is a very interesting dynamic that's occurring between Donald Trump and Boris Johnson that's beginning to emerge that may be signaling why we're in the situation we're in. I've written articles about this in the past, and I'll link to some of them in the podcast description down below. Time is short. We've got just over a month before the transition period, the potential for an extension to the transition period could take place. And where are we? Well, we're nowhere. Nothing has changed in these first 5 months. And with the European Union, when you're negotiating with them, nothing changes until the last 48 hours before whatever deadline we're up against, because they just play the same game over and over and over again, that we're right, you're wrong, you need to negotiate, you're being bad people, these are our terms, take them or leave them. Well, yeah, that's nice, but the question then comes, do you have any leverage? And last year's negotiations between Johnson and the European Council on the withdrawal agreement proved that at the end of the day, the EU has no leverage over the UK. None. Zero. Ots. Germany needs the UK, okay? They're fundamentally split right now between Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator for the EU, and David Frost, the chief negotiator for the UK under Boris Johnson. They're fundamentally split on every issue that's been in place since the day after the original Brexit vote on June 23rd, 2016. They're arguing about the same things they've been arguing about for 4 years. And yet somehow Barnier thinks that he's going to get something over on these guys 4 years down the line. Now, Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, described negotiating with the EU as if you go in there with all of your ideas and all your charts and all of your well thought out proposals, and they listen, disinterestedly, but they listen. And then when you're done, they look at you as if you just sung the Swedish national anthem. And then they continue to go on and say, well, we're going to do this. No engagement whatsoever. It's like you're talking to the ultimate bunch of autistics or people who have aphasia. They just don't understand the words that you're saying, and they're just off in their own little world. I'm like, really? Okay, well, but that's the hubris that these people have because they represent a transnational oligarchy intent on creating a global superstructure of central banks with the ECB effectively at the head. Don't kid yourself. That's the goal. And they firmly believe that they have all the cards, so why should they negotiate with anybody? They have all the power. You don't. Because everybody who is anybody is backing the EU's position, so why should these technocrats and politicians who were put in place to implement this plan that they have, why on earth would they listen to you peons? You people do not matter. And that's literally the mindset. You have to get that through your head to understand what's happening with Brexit. Because that's what they mean by they saying the Britain can only leave the European Union if they leave on a level playing field with the EU. A level playing field means EU oversight on all UK trade and labor policy and every other damn policy. That's not Brexit. It's doublespeak. Nothing more, nothing less. So last week, David Frost sent a letter to Michel Barnier outlining why nothing that Barnier has put on the table is anything close to an honest free trade agreement between equals. What Barnier keeps sending over is a surrender doctrine. This is basically terms of surrender. You will do these things if you want to be able to trade with us on our terms ever. And Frost is like, we're 7 months away from trading on WTO terms, dude. What's your problem? He outlines every area where the EU is asking for more than it has in free trade agreements, existing free trade agreements with such big players as the United States, Japan, and Canada. And all of it is so disingenuous. It's so ridiculous. It literally is Barnier playing to a captive pro-European media and chattering class that these people literally don't understand that there are people in the world who are not them. And they live in their own little bubble to the point where it's almost like Barnier, when you listen to him talk, it's like he doesn't realize that there may be people out there who don't share his view of the world. The solipsism is kind of frightening because Frost sends this letter out after the last round of talks where the reports were that Barnier stormed out of the room red-faced and angry and pissed off. What was he expecting? The UK has been very clear since the minute Boris Johnson took over. You guys can state the same thing over and over again, but they haven't budged on anything, and you've had to budge at every moment. When Barnier was finally sidelined during the talks last year, French President Emmanuel Macron took over, the UK had done almost everything. And any concessions they got were only into the political declaration. And the political declaration is not law. And Barnier keeps coming back to the political declaration. Well, you're not negotiating in good faith. Well, tough. We don't have to. The political declaration is an opinion piece written by a bunch of people to say, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're not going to turn that into law or anything. You're out of your mind. It's nonsensical. But yet this continues. And the goal here is for nothing more than to try and get the UK to sign off on a transition and get another 2 years, which is politically beyond the pale in Britain. My good friend Mike Shedlock realized this months ago and wrote an article, a great article. It says Michel Barnier is just incompetent because he's never had to negotiate against anything other than sock puppets for the EU. I mean, it's not like negotiating against Theresa May, who's arguing the EU side, with Ollie Robbins, who might as well be a whore for the European Commission. Like, seriously, like, you think you're such a great and brave negotiator when you're negotiating against yourself? Well, good luck with that, dude. Because Johnson's team isn't that. And they haven't been from the beginning. And you would think that at this moment in time, the EU would finally get through their heads that this is not the same dynamic. But they continue to play to the press, hoping that they can get something. What they're hoping for is that they can generate enough scandal within Johnson's administration. That's what this whole Dominic Cummings breaking COVID lockdown thing is all about. It's just purely to create and throw shade on Boris Johnson in order to try and, I don't know, get him thrown out of power or something. It's ridiculous. It's sad. And that's why they cannot go for any kind of extension. These free trade agreement talks have to end by December, because if you give these people another 2 years to screw you over, they're hoping that they can get Johnson out of office and they get whatever they want. And they'll just continue to do this. So the latest news, as of this morning, is that Barnier might be willing to compromise a little bit on the fisheries angle. Now, for those of you who don't know, the fisheries angle is very simple. Most of the fishing in the European Union takes place in UK waters, and the UK is not actually allowed to keep any of the fish that they catch. Everybody else in the EU gets to fish in their waters and take their stuff away and take their fish away, which is an incredibly explosive political issue in the UK, and it's one that Nigel Farage beat into everybody's head, because it was just so egregious. So there's Barnier on the most minuscule of issues, but the most politically charged of issues, trying to say, okay, we'll compromise on fisheries a little bit. Well, we'll talk about compromising on fisheries. We're open to the discussion about that. And you know that it's going to be this. We're open to discussing a compromise on fisheries if you are willing to sign an extension to the free trade agreement, because that's what that is. It's just a trap. See, we're negotiating. Come on. Now we gave you something, now you give us something back. I'm like, no. So Barnier gives you a nickel and he wants $1 billion. I'm like, how's that for the trade? I'm like, how about you go fuck yourself and we'll call it even? Because that's the way these negotiations are laying out. All right. It's a trap. Michel Barnier has zero leverage, and I've got 7 points, 6 points, 6 major points and a couple of minor points as to explain why. Everybody knows point number one. Germany needs the UK far more than the UK needs Germany. Germany's exports to the UK far outweigh UK's exports to Germany. The balance of trade is wildly in the UK's favor. Number two, Johnson cannot afford to pay into the EU budget in a post-COVID world. These are billions of dollars that he needs to spend at home, rebuilding England and rebuilding in Great Britain at large, right? The whole of the United Kingdom. Because he's got a political problem up in Scotland. He's got a little bit of a political problem down in Wales. He's got a little bit of a political problem in Northern Ireland. Well, maybe more than a little one. So that money needs to be spent at home, okay? And Johnson got reelected on the platform that he would rebuild the Midlands and the Northeast. These are labor strongholds that he's flipped to Tory on the promise that he would rebuild them by putting money into them for the first time in decades when they were hollowed out thanks to the EU. And all those jobs shipped overseas. And so there's no way he can go back on that promise if he wants to stay in power. The money can't leave the shores, and it's got to go to the areas hardest hit by decades of living under the rule of the EU. Moreover, to point number 4, the EU is fracturing politically at every level, and the BOE, the Bank of England, is in no way, manner, shape, or form want to be subservient to the European Central Bank, which, by the way, is, of all the major central banks, the only one that can actually go bankrupt. So if you're thinking about this even if you're a globalist, which I think Boris Johnson is, even if you're an evil corporatist globalist, which he is for the most part, you're still looking at the ECB and the European Union going, I still don't want to hitch my ride to that sinking ship. I'm going to build a different globalist structure my own way. I'm going to go my own way to do this. That's fine, but I'm not doing it with y'all because y'all are nuts. The next thing is the one that I don't think people have really factored in yet, and that's his relationship with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's relationship and Donald Trump's desire to repair the relationship between the UK and the United States. See, there's been a very interesting dynamic for years. While the UK was part of the European Union, the United Kingdom was run by EU technocrats with British accents. And of course, so was the United States, for all intents and purposes, run by globalists in the pay of European oligarchs to funnel all of the wealth of the UK and the United States into political capital and all of it into the European Union through offshore banking centers known as Eurodollar markets. This is part and parcel of all of this discussion, that dynamic for years. And Trump represents a fundamental shift in that dynamic because he doesn't believe in that. And Brexit, as a vote, didn't believe in that. And I'm not sure where Boris Johnson falls on that scale, and that's the problem. But I think he realizes that the political winds have shifted against the European Union, certainly within the continent. They've shifted against them terribly in England, and I mean England, not the United Kingdom as a whole, because Scotland is Scotland, and the United States. And I'm looking at Boris Johnson, and I'm thinking about Queen Elizabeth. And at this point, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I don't see Queen Elizabeth wanting to be ruled by Germans. Like, no. The United Kingdom should be allied with their traditional partners in the United States. And the United States is still the biggest seat at the table. And I think what I'm seeing in a kind of nebulous way, and I can't speak to it deeply, but that the UK is wanting to remain an independent actor balancing between the United States and China, with Johnson slowly but surely falling into Trump's orbit. And to me, Trump's ascendance and his winning the domestic fights against Obama, against Clinton, against Russiagate, against Ukrainegate, and the impeachment, and all of this stuff tells me that Johnson understands this dynamic, understands that Trump is ascendant, and will most likely be reelected in the fall. It's why he just decided to change his stance on Huawei. This is him giving a sop to Donald Trump and saying, look, I'm on your side. This is a big issue for you. You've opened up the new Cold War against China. I'm with you on this. I also happen to believe that both the U.S. and the UK, i.e. the CIA and MI6, are deeply embedded in the protests in Hong Kong that have been going on effectively for over almost a year now, because they're trying to maintain control over Hong Kong and getting it independent while China puts the clamp down on it. There's a lot of discussion and division as to whether or not this is positive for China or positive for the United States. Personally, I think this is positive for China, but that's a different discussion for a different day. I don't want to get into that right now because the dynamics in Hong Kong haven't quite played themselves out yet. But when you look at the situation in the United States, Trump is ascendant and he has attacked the Federal Reserve's independence, which is a major pillar of the post-World War II institutional architecture. And the goal of the last 70 years has been to create independent central banks in all of the major economies following the Fed's lead. But the CARES Act here in the United States fundamentally shifts the balance of power back towards the Treasury Department in a way that hasn't been since 1913. Because the Treasury Department can now directly monetize, force the Fed to directly monetize and allow them to buy stocks and nationalize everything. It's a dangerous and horrible situation, and any Austrian economist or libertarian or any free marketeer should be horrified by all this. But in broad strokes, attacking the Fed's independence may be Trump's biggest move. And the Bank of England, wanting to retain its independence, sees the opportunity here to remove itself from the auspice of the EU, allow the EU to fail and break up, and reestablish US-UK dominance over, quote-unquote, the first world, while separating the US and China from each other economically. Basically, in a nutshell, the UK has decided to hitch its wagon to the United States versus the EU at the political level, at the highest levels of its political class, at the Tories and at the royalty level. And the Europhiles and those guys, they've all lost power, and they don't have any power at this point. And the biggest tell for this is that Andrew Bailey, the new head of the Bank of England, and Jerome Powell are aligned on negative interest rates, i.e. they do not want them. The market may force them into negative interest rates because of the unprecedented nature of the situation and because there are trillions of dollars at stake for the very people they're fighting against, and it may force them into a situation where rates dip negative. But that interest rate differential between them and between the Bank of England and the United States and the ECB is enormous, because the US and the UK will not move into capital destructive negative rates as long as Powell holds out against Trump, which may not happen. While the ECB is trying desperately to stay afloat, and that's what's going on with Merkel and Macron and their $500 billion corona bonds, but they're doing it through the European Commission, and it's a backdoor debt mutualization thing that they just announced last week. So putting all this together, it becomes very interesting because Germany takes over the EU Commission in July. EU Commission presidency in July. Merkel will be in charge of signing off on any free trade agreement deal. She's not going to compromise because that's what she does. She will take things right to the limit like she always does. And she will most importantly await the outcome of the U.S. election in November, hoping that Trump gets removed from office, thereby undercutting Johnson and thereby being able to then put the screws to the UK and bring them back into the EU's fold and have Germany effectively take over all of Europe again. I don't think that's going to work. But that's what Merkel's playing for, and that's what she's going to instruct Barnier on. Now, the bigger question is, are we going to get an extension on June 30th? Odds of that are incredibly low, because as I've just laid out, to me, Johnson sees his future with the United States. Therefore, he gives a sop to Trump by saying, okay, I won't use Huawei in our 5G network, or I'll review using Huawei in our 5G network. That's his way of saying to Trump, yeah, let's continue to have free trade agreement talks, because Trump is making this a prerequisite on whether or not the UK gets a free trade agreement with the United States. So the US and the UK at a certain level are going to war with China. And remember that a lot of pro-China stuff happened over the last 20 years in the UK, the selling off of the LBMA to the Chinese. A lot of things happened under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown that were like, why did that happen? And we all talked about it. And then now we kind of know why. Because when the UK was part of the EU, they were aligning for a China-Europe global superstructure under the TTIP and the TPP and the Paris Accords and all that stuff. And what's happening now is a fundamental split into the multipolar world. Russia, China, Iran moving away from wanting a different central bank regime than the one that exists in the West, emanating out of the United States. And the UK and Brexit is one of those major fulcra. And so it's imperative that the EU is weakened in the short term, in the medium term, and ultimately destroyed to break it up. It's unnecessary. The United States is not long for this life either, but it's still a different world. And we're going to wind up in the multipolar world if Brexit goes through. If Trump is deposed and Johnson has to fold back into the EU, it's going to be even more ugly than we're already expecting it to be. And it's going to be bad. It's going to look like China's social credit system. It's going to look even worse than that. At the very least, if all of this plays out, the dynamics here, the damage everybody will do to each other, the lack of centralized control, and the damage done to the central banking regime in the process would actually be a net positive for humanity. At least that's the way I'm reading it as of right now. You know, when I first started looking at all of this stuff, I remember I go back to like 2008, 2007, 2008, when I had my first real kind of breakthrough insight into what was happening. And I just said to myself, this is obviously the Western central banks versus the Eastern central banks fight. Like that was that was as deep as it was, right? That's all that I went into my head, came out of my head that morning. It was back in 2008 during the early days of the financial crisis. I had understood the world to that point. That's as deep as I understood it. The scary part about it is that insight was far more correct than I ever thought it was. This has been the Gold Goats and Guns podcast, episode 35 for Tuesday, May 26, 2020. If you like what you heard today, give a like and subscribe down below. Follow me on Spreaker or iTunes or Podbean or Spotify. Hey, try out Spotify because of, Joe Rogan and his quest to blow up the Death Star and take down the evil empire known as Google, which I fully and thoroughly and wholeheartedly support. Other than that, I'll be back next week. I think I will have a guest. I'm almost positive. I haven't checked my email box, but I just got an email in from a couple of guests that I've asked to be on the show. So looking forward to that. You guys take care. You be well. We'll talk soon. Keep your stick on the ice.